The Messianic Psalms in the New Testament by B.B. Warfield. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Messianic Psalms of the New Testament. Luke 1, verses 42 to 45, verses 46 to 55, verses 68 to 79, chapter 2, verses 29 to 32. We could ask no more striking indication of the essential unity of the Old and New dispensations, or of the Old and New Testaments, than is furnished by the fact that the line of division between the one pair is not coincident with that between the other. The New Testament begins before the Old dispensation closes. The first pages of the Gospels are the concluding records of the Old economy. The first verses of Mark are immediately consecutive to the last of Malachi. Matthew introduces the history of Jesus after exactly the same fashion in which Genesis introduces the history of Abraham, Genesis 11 verse 10 and following. The beginnings of Luke and of 1 Samuel are not only one in spirit but also one in form. John opens his account of the new creation in words closely parallel with those in which Moses opens his account of the first creation. These connections are not accidental. Taken separately, they are deeply significant of the characteristic features of each gospel. Taken together, they vividly illustrate the unity of the two testaments. The resemblances of form extend even to details. The pious Elkanah and his devout but childless wife were the types of Zacharias and Elizabeth. The sanctuary with its solemn worship was the scene of both promises. The joy of both fulfillments blossomed forth with songs of praise to God. The declaration that the child Samuel grew on and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men, 1 Samuel 2 verse 26, finds its counterpart concerning John in Luke 1 verse 80, and especially concerning Jesus in the double statements of Luke 2 verse 40 and 52, proving to us that the human development of this child was just like that of John or of Samuel. But the likeness of spirit is even deeper. The reader of the earlier portions of the Gospels feels himself still on Old Testament ground, and it is among the characteristic scenes of Old Testament life, and specifically Old Testament circles of thought, that he is asked to move. It required the 3 years of Christ's public ministry, culminating in his death and rising again, to sweep all this away forever and fix a great gulf between this new and that old, which all the centuries since Malachi had left essentially unaltered, proving to us that this teacher was not a native product of the soil in which he grew. Approaching them from this point of view, we are not surprised to find the canticles that are embedded in this portion of the narrative redolent of the old economy. In form, manner, matter, spirit, they are indistinguishable from the praise songs of Israel that constituted the hymn book of the ancient church, and it was a true instinct which led some scribes of the Septuagint and the earliest printers to attach them to the Psalter. That they exhibit all the characteristics of Hebrew poetry in their structure lies on their face. The parallelism of members, the arrangement of strophes, the regular beat of the accent are not only discoverable but prominent. Even that one of them, the character of which has been least insisted upon, the salutation of Elizabeth, Luke 1 verses 42 to 45, is unmistakably verse, even elaborately and artistically verse. Beginning with short lines of 3 beats of the accent each, the first strophe closes with a longer line of 4, while the second strophe continues with this longer line, to close itself with a still longer line of 5 tones. The song thus happily combines the art of the fine ode of Exodus 15, where the 4-toned lines culminate at the end of the strophe in one of 5 tones, and that of the 23rd Psalm, much of the beauty of which is due to the gradual lengthening of the lines in each succeeding strophe, leaving on the reader's mind the sense of increasing satisfaction in Jehovah's goodness. The effect of this arrangement in our present case is to erect verse 43 into the climax of the first strophe and verse 45 into the lingering climax of the whole song. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed the fruit of thy womb. And whence to me is this, that the mother of my Lord should come unto me. For lo, as came the voice of thy greeting into my ears. Leapt in rejoicing the babe in my womb. And happy is she that believed that fulfillment shall be to what was told her from the Lord. When read thus in accordance with its structure, this beautiful canticle is seen to be a celebration of Mary's faith in believing that there should be a fulfillment to what was spoken to her from the Lord, and as leading up to this, every part of it takes its proper subordinate place. This faith, astounding in itself, the most supreme example probably of perfect trust in God, and absolute self-devotion to him and his will that human flesh has ever given, was all the more striking to Elizabeth on account of its contrast with the unbelief of her own husband under a far less severe trial. No wonder that when Mary appeared before her spirit-illuminated eyes, verse 41, she seemed the embodiment of faith, that modest virgin with clasped hands whom Hermas saw in vision, through whom the elect of God are saved, and from whom spring all the Christian graces as fair daughters of a fair mother. Mary is thus, in Elizabeth's eyes, the most blessed of women, because the most faithful, and it suits well that the first psalm of the New Testament should take the form of a praise of the fundamental evangelical virtue. The excitement which the commentators see in this psalm, we find it somewhat difficult to recognize. It was a glad shout, verse 42, but its joyful cry is more like a paean over a victory already accomplished than the excited and exciting call to an onset. Rapid in its movement it no doubt is, and full of the rush and life of a stream in the mountains. In this, Mary's answering song is in strong contrast with it. This is the same stream flowing with deep and tranquil waters through the rich lowlands. Dr. Godot thinks that this greater calmness is the mirror of greater happiness. Certainly, it is the reflection of deeper spiritual life, born of experience both of sorrow and of God's strength for consolation. All through Israel's history such songs had been sung, and had we met with the Magnificat in the midst of the Psalter, say, somewhere about the 30th, or 98th, or 103rd, or 111th Psalm, it would have occasioned no surprise, and seemed in no sense out of place. But such songs were never sung in Israel save in the night season, a night season for the nation and a night season for the singer. The ploughmen must plough the back and make long their furrows, Psalm 129 verse 3, before so richly golden a harvest can mature, before the assured conviction can grow so stout in the heart that Jehovah is righteous and will cut asunder the cords of the wicked, and put to shame all the enemies of Zion. When Mary uttered those words of such sweet and humble sublimity, "Behold, the bondmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word," she at once received the rankling sword thrust into her soul, and steeped her soul in a balm that healed and more than healed all possible sword thrusts. Here we see the rich fruitage of her faith, yet how little there is of the personal in her psalm. If it were not for the feminine form of the word servant in verse 48, it might have been written, for all it appears on the surface, by any Chorite at any time since the opening of the Psalter. It is Elizabeth who sings the praise of Mary's faith. Mary answers by a praise of God, his grace, might, mercy, justice, and faithfulness. The difference is significant, perhaps characteristic. In poetical structure, the Magnificat is framed quite after the model of the older Tehillah. There are 4 strophes of 4 lines each, verses 46 to 48, 49 to 50, 51 to 53, 54 to 55, and the movement of the thought advances regularly through them, gradually increasing in animation until the climax is reached in the 3rd, and, quote, the song drops down to its nest again in the 4th, which is, as it were, the Amen of the canticle, end quote. The tone of the whole is happy, though solemn, such as befitted one so highly honored, and yet so unconscious of self. When we are asked to observe the royal character impressed upon it, we can see it only through a mist darkly. It needed no descendant of kings to magnify the Lord for overturning the proud and elevating the lowly in fulfillment of his promise to Abraham. The absence of all mention of David, and the turning of hope rather to the promise to Abraham, is noticeable on the contrary part, and almost strange after the angelic words, verse 32, "The Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David." Elizabeth, verse 43, and Zacharias, verse 69, thought more of the royalty of the coming one than Mary. Her heart was occupied with God's mercy in sending him. This, too, is probably characteristic. On the other hand, the prevailing priestly character of Zacharias' hymn is somewhat strongly marked. It would have been natural to no one but a priest to cast his messianic hopes so prevailingly in the moulds of the sanctuary. Just as the Magnificat takes up the theme with which Elizabeth ended and recounts the great things that Mary believes will flow from what God has spoken to her, so the Benedictus begins where Mary ends, with the faithfulness of God to his promises, and it is only after praising him through 3 rich strophes conceived and expressed quite in Old Testament form, for his fulfillment of them, that he can turn to add 2 more for the outpouring of his joy over the part given his own Son in the saving work. Even then, the so long expected Son is mentioned only briefly, and as it were by the way, to give rise to a renewed burst of praise to God for his mercy to Israel. Here too the personal is sunk in the national and religious, or say rather the lower personal in the higher personal. Zacharias' mind is full of God's glory, of his Son only as the promise of coming brightness, the faint gleam preceding the dayspring from on high. Even the swan song of Simeon is of essential Old Testament type, and only supplies us with a tehillah to set over against our 3 tehillot. When we open Luke's Gospel, therefore, and read these stirring lyrics, we feel no break with Israel's whole past. Only, as in the times of Moses and of David and of Jehoshaphat and of Nehemiah, so now again, when the Lord once more visits his people, their response breaks forth anew, and the harps, which had been so long hanging upon the willows, are tuned afresh to celebrate their new deliverance. And if this is true of their outer, no less is it true of their innermost characteristics. In the Messianic hopes which they express, they belong as thoroughly to the old dispensation as they do in their structure and general tone. There is deeply stamped upon them the impress of the period in which the hope of redemption was national, and salvation belonged especially to Israel. They are oblivious also of the whole space of time that was to intervene between the coming of the Messiah and the consummation of his kingdom. This markedly Old Testament standpoint would have been impossible after our Lord had begun his public work, much more after his death and resurrection. The joyful expectation of Elizabeth is damped by no anticipated sorrow. Mary sings of the impending establishment of the reign of righteousness with perfect frankness and no misgivings. Zacharias celebrates the re-erected theocracy and the universal peace as if already at hand. Only Simeon has a wider outlook beyond the nation and a deeper hint of a ministry of suffering, but goes in neither matter beyond Old Testament warrant, or indeed beyond Old Testament words. In this we have a valuable witness to the genuineness of the canticles, which otherwise would be an incredible post eventum contra eventum. In only one respect do they sharply separate themselves from their companions in the Psalter. They represent the time of God's promised intervention as already come, and the agents in introducing the kingdom as actually present. It is just because Mary is the mother of the promised one that Elizabeth pronounces her blessed. Elizabeth's babe, though yet unborn, has already begun his life work of pointing to the Messiah, already gives his witness that he that cometh after him is greater than he. The ground of Mary's praise to God is that, in spite of her low estate, he has selected her as the vessel of his election for bringing the seed of Abraham into the world, and this is the mighty, holy, just, and faithful thing that he has done which commands her song. It is the momentous fact that the predicted forerunner, who should prepare the way before Jehovah's face, is before his eyes, that inspires Zacharias to sing the faithfulness of God in fulfilling his oath of redemption. And Simeon's watch is over only because the salvation of God lies in his aged arms. This is the outstanding development from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New, a development that hangs upon the unnoted passage of time and the gradual unfolding of God's purpose of redemption in act. Whether there be along with this any corresponding advance in the clearness with which Messiah's person and work are revealed needs closer scrutiny to discover. It was God's way to precede every development of his plan in history with a preparatory revelation, and it is because a new step in history is now to be taken that the inspiring Spirit once more appears in Israel. But will this justify us in too confidently expecting advance in revelation beyond the great advance in the definition of the time as already arrived, the announcement that the fullness of time has come? The careful student will, at all events, soon observe that, this eliminated, not a word remains in any of the 4 songs which might not have been spoken equally well before the close of the Old Testament canon, the counterpart of which does not occur in the Old Testament records. The discovery of this fact, however, does not quite determine the question before us. The very same words may be fraught with very different meanings at widely different times, and this is of the essence especially of prophecy, and is a necessary quality of any revelation intended as a message to more than a single generation. Just as the sacred writers so write of physical fact, as for instance in the opening chapter of Genesis, as to be seen so soon as the knowledge of scientific truth has grown among men to presuppose a deeper knowledge than any of their readers possessed for some thousands of years, and yet so speak as to convey their special moral message to the man of their own time without clogging their understanding by teaching them science before the time of science. So the sacred prophecies are so framed as to presuppose much more than is apparent to men of the generation of their delivery, but which becomes progressively plainer from age to age with advancing knowledge of the things prophesied, and thus carry in their bosom a message for all time in ever-growing definiteness and richness. This is mere fact, and so far from opposing the strictly scientific exposition of the prophecies is the inevitable fruit of it. They cannot be made by a severe grammatical exegesis to bear another character. While the cosmology of Hesiod cannot be read in harmony with the signs of the 19th century, that of Genesis cannot be read out of harmony with it. While the oracles of Delphi do not grow in wealth of content with advancing years, those of the Old Testament become more full of revelation and more precious in meaning with every age. But it is a fact which is in harmony with no theory of the nature of prophecy except that one which sees in it a message from God to man, intended not to write history beforehand, but to give him a support and help in leading a holy life of equal validity for all earthly time, nay, of increasing value as time rolls on. But if the older prophecies themselves thus become richer in meaning as time advances, and their presuppositions of fact and manner, beyond what was openly declared, become clear through additional revelations on advancing fulfillment, the repetition of the words of the older predictions need not be confined to their earliest and narrowest understanding. The mere fact, then, that all that the Psalms of Luke's first chapter say may be paralleled out of the Old Testament does not quite exclude an advance in them beyond the revelations of the Old Testament, especially if we are thinking not of what might have been understood from them, but of what was understood from them. It is important for us to observe this distinction, the distinction between unfolding revelation and growth in understanding what is revealed. This is all the more necessary that we are dealing with compositions of a kind that take their place in both lines of development, that are both revelations from God and the response to God of pious and instructed hearts. It is not only conceivable but certain that Mary and Elizabeth and Zacharias and Simeon understood far less than their words express. We do not say less than they can be made to express merely, but less than they actually do express and cannot be made not to express. To ask what the words mean and what they meant to them are two very different questions, and we are to expect for them two different answers. Historically, the answer to the latter question preceded that to the former. Exegetically, the former must precede the latter. This would not be the case if we were seeking the original and typical senses of the words, but it is the case when what we are seeking is the intended and the understood senses. The intended sense is obtained by historico-grammatical exegesis, the understood sense by a further historical inquiry as to how much of this was comprehended by the agents of its delivery to men. This no doubt treats the original speakers in some measure as if they were hearers of their own words, but there is no help for it. The phenomena of revelation are peculiar, and demand for their explanation a theory, of revelation. The prophets diligently inquired into and sought what manner of time the Spirit of Christ that was in them pointed unto, 1 Peter 1 verses 10 and 11, and delivered messages that even the angels did not at the moment understand, which unfolding years alone could make plain, but which in time, through additional revelation or progressive fulfillment, or both, were to become plain to even the humblest student of the Word. It must be confessed that when we address ourselves to determining the former of these questions, we do not discover a great advance in our Psalms on the revelations made in the Old Testament. That the advent of the Messiah brings blessing to Israel and begins the fulfillment of God's precious promises, that it introduces a crisis into the world by which its present course is overturned, the imaginations of the proud brought to naught, the powerful cast down and the lowly elevated, the hungry filled with good things and the rich sent empty away, that it is the crowning proof of God's mercy and brings not only relief from all enemies who make the service of God hard, but deliverance from the burden of sin through a strong redemption, that it introduces the eternal reign of peace, that its blessings will extend even to the Gentile world, and the purchase of them will demand suffering on the part of the Messiah himself. All this is Old Testament teaching. A close scrutiny is required to discover any advance on the Old Testament at all, and when it is found, it is seen to consist not in the enunciation of new particulars, but in the relative prominence given to the Old. For instance, the Old Testament leaves the essential divinity of the Messiah little insisted on, especially in the Psalms. Many Psalms are theocratic rather than Messianic, and represent Jehovah himself as coming for the redemption of his people. Jehovah's coming and Messiah's coming are thus equally asserted, but the two are not plainly identified. The two lines run in parallel. In the New Testament Psalms, the identification seems to be made. When we remember that the angel had declared to Zacharias that his son should go before the face of the Lord, and to Mary that her son should be called the Son of the Most High, verse 32, Holy, verse 35, Son of God, verse 35, the humble cry of Elizabeth, Whence is this to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me, verse 43, quickened as it was by the forerunner's leaping joy, takes on most solemn meaning, a meaning which is renewedly certified by the immediate reiteration of the same word Lord in an unmistakably divine sense, verse 45. In the light again of the preceding revelations by the angels, and the song of Elizabeth, as just interpreted, Zacharias' words, Thou, child, shalt be called the prophet of the Most High, for thou shalt go before the face of the Lord to prepare his ways, verse 76, seems to give witness to the divinity of the coming one. The spiritual nature of the Messianic work is another point which Zacharias' song places beyond question. By the coming of the Messiah, no doubt, a horn of salvation is raised up in the house of David, salvation from their enemies and from the hand of all that hate them, verses 68 to 71. But even this outward salvation is declared to be in order that, being delivered out of the hand of their enemies, they should serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness all their days, verse 74. And the great Messianic work that is on Zacharias' heart is carefully explained in verse 76 to be giving the knowledge of salvation to his people, as consisting in the forgiveness of their sins on account of God's bowels of mercy. This it is that is the special work of the forerunner to accomplish, and without this the Messiah's way would not be prepared. It almost seems as if the false development of Messianic hopes among the Jews was here recognized, and the purpose of God in sending a forerunner explained to be in order to correct them. There is some reason to believe that Zacharias' song hints further at the typical character of the Old Testament sacrifices and their fulfillment in the coming one. He speaks of his advent as working a ransom, verse 68, for his people, and throughout has his mind on the symbolism of the altar. If this were found likely, it would imply a shadowy hint of the sufferings of the Messiah, a great revelation not proceeding beyond the prophecies of the Old Testament, indeed, but very far beyond any expectations of the time. Whether Zacharias obscurely presupposes them or not, Simeon openly declares them, chapter 2, verses 34 and 35. The child that lay in his arms was set for a sign spoken against, and a sword should pierce through Mary's soul on account of him. And here it is worth our while to observe the gulf that separates these songs from the contemporary, or then recent pseudo-epigraphic literature of the Jews. They, as well as those, no doubt expected a superhuman Messiah, but so far from seeing in him a spiritual leader, they looked in him for nothing but a worldly conqueror, and after Simeon, no man who was not taught directly by Christianity dreamt of a suffering Messiah for 100 years. Justin Martyr makes his Jewish opponent Trypho, who has been with great probability identified with the famous Rabbi Tarfon, say, quote, For we knew that he must suffer and be led as a sheep, end quote. And the Sifre represents the Rabbi Jose, the Galilean, as quoting Isaiah 53 verses 5 and 6 to prove that the Messiah should be humbled and suffer. These two contemporary and closely connected rabbis, somewhere in the second quarter of the 2nd century, represent the earliest dawning Jewish consciousness of the suffering Messiah. If then our New Testament canticles cannot be Christian forgeries, neither can they be deemed the natural outgrowth of the unilluminated Jewish consciousness of their time. And when we declare that they move entirely in the circle of thought of Old Testament times, we separate them from contemporary Judaism almost as sharply as from subsequent Christianity. Let us keep in mind, however, that this is not the same as saying that the singers of those songs were out of sympathy with the hopes of their day. If the Old Testament predictions were misunderstood, why not also these songs? It may seem that almost no room is left to doubt that Mary and Elizabeth knew the divine nature of the child that the former was to bear, when we read the angelic messages and Elizabeth's humble cry. Yet how colourless Mary's own song becomes on such a supposition, and the subsequent narrative leaves no room at all to doubt that they did not at all comprehend what was said either to or by them. That wonderful day at Caesarea Philippi appears first to have begotten an understanding in men of such ineffable words. In spite of the hints of Zacharias, the spirituality of the kingdom which Christ set up was never understood until he had died and risen again. and the path of suffering which he trod, although Simeon had openly declared it, was an offence to every heart, until he who had suffered returned again to open their eyes with the cry, O fools, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things? If then, when we try to trace the progressive history of Revelation itself, we find these Psalms moving entirely in the circle of Old Testament thought, when our object is to trace the growing perception of God's plan of salvation in the minds of his saints, we find even those that were waiting for the consolation of Israel at the very moment of his coming, lagging in their hopes still far behind what had been of old time revealed to the fathers. The psalms that they sing under the inspiration of God are Old Testament psalms, even the essence and sublimation of Old Testament psalmody. The faith they hold as their personal possession lifted itself in confidence and intensity, but probably not much in nature or contents above that of their time. They needed to wait for the understanding of even what God had spoken through them, for the time when he whom they expected so longingly should return from a sojourn in the grave, before their minds could be opened, that they might understand the Scriptures, and know that it was written that the Christ should suffer and rise again the third day, and only so enter into his glory. Luke 24, verses 45 and 46. As yet it was at the first, when they could not understand these things, but when Jesus was glorified, then remembered they that these things were written of him, and that they had done these things unto him. John 12, verse 16.